Good afternoon and welcome to the 9th installment of the Alliance's COVID-19 webinar series, Effective Advocacy During the Pandemic. I'm Mindy Mitchell, a Senior Technical Assistant Specialist here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And joining us today for this important webinar will be Jerry Jones, National Field Director here at the Alliance, Dora Gallo, President and CEO at A Community of Friends in Los Angeles, California, and Stephen Piasecki, Upstate Coordinator at Supportive Housing Network of New York, also known as SHINY. I have just a few housekeeping items before we get started with the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and all registrants for this webinar will receive an email with an accompanying link to the recording, the slides, and additional resources within 24 hours of the broadcast. All attendees are on mute and will remain so throughout the broadcast, and all video functions have been turned off except for speakers. The Zoom chat function is also disabled, but if you have questions, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be pulling those together for our speakers at the end of the webinar. Questions will be held until after all the presentations are complete, and then there will be time for Q&A in which all of the panelists participate. Any questions that we don't get to today will be gathered by Alliance staff and will be included on the Ending Homelessness Forum, which I'll talk about in just a minute. The Alliance will continue its COVID-19 webinar series next week when we will host 2 more webinars. One of them is on ensuring that our homelessness response system during this crisis focus on addressing unsheltered homelessness. And another will be on ensuring that that response is racially equitable. So you can see the dates on your screen. You can sign up for those resources and future webinars on the Alliance's webinar series page. Finally, if you haven't already, please sign up for the Ending Homelessness Forum, which is a place for communities to obtain information on federal funding and guidance on the COVID-19 homeless response. You can also share information about the successes and emerging promising practices, as well as questions for each other on how to confront common challenges that communities and programs are facing during this crisis. Now, to start today's webinar, we have the Alliance's National Field Director, Jerry Jones. Jerry, go ahead, unmute yourself, and we'll get started. Okay, Jerry, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. I was unmuting as you were muting, so thank you, Mindy. And thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll dive into the, I prepared a few slides for the presentation, so we can go to the next slide, which starts in a very basic way. I appreciate everyone dialing in, and I'm guessing there's at least probably 2 broad categories of people who are in the audience today. Folks who pay a lot of attention to policy and are working at state or local housing coalitions, homeless coalitions, and tracking legislation closely. And then folks who are maybe direct service providers and supportive housing developers, and whose main job is delivering programs and services for homeless folks as they're showing up every day in need of help. And I recognize that this first slide starts with something pretty basic, but and while I also recognize that most coalitions also do some direct service programs, and many direct service providers also do some policy work or have policy staff, but some providers don't always have the luxury to track the policy debate as closely as others. And so I start with this slide to ask the question of which congressional district you're in. I will say that starting there, this information is, I think, especially useful to policy professionals and full-time advocates in a coalition, for instance, in that we all too often, and this is true for the entire homelessness sector, we sometimes leave others behind with jargon and acronyms and bill numbers, and assuming everyone's in touch with their legislators. Yet we realize that our base of influence is that everyone on this call somehow is involved in working to end homelessness and to create affordable housing, and that's really the only reason politicians listen to our organizations in the first place, because of that relationship with solving homelessness and affordable housing needs. So I guess as preface, we need an advocacy strategy that works for the entire sector, and not just those like myself who make their living tracking, state capitals and Washington committee rooms, right? As important as that may be. So we have to keep everything we do, our entire strategy to win more resources for homelessness and housing, relevant to the organizations on the front lines. And as a step beyond that, we need to also have an advocacy strategy that's relevant to people who have actually experienced homelessness, so that we can build their genuine participation and guidance, and so that we can be accountable to people that we serve. But that only happens if we build an advocacy infrastructure that works for everyone. And so I wanted to start this presentation with that basic question of which congressional district is your office or program located in, because not everyone who works in homelessness knows the answer to that. And a lot of people who work in accounting people who run bagel shops wouldn't answer that question correctly either, but it matters as we're trying to impact the public debate. If you are if you're an organization with multiple sites in a big metro area, you could be in multiple districts. And in fact, if you don't know the answer to that first question, which congressional district are you in, you can go to the U.S. House of Representatives website, and there's a tool at the very top of the landing page there. If you type in your zip code, they can tell you which district you're in. And so it's really as straightforward as that, identifying who are your policymakers, who are your two senators, who's in Congress representing you, and to figure this out also for your state representatives. Which city council member are you in their district? Who's your county supervisor? And here's an important point as well. If you're a state coalition, if you're immersed in policy work, you still ought to be figuring this out for every organization in your membership. You need to know what your legislative footprint is to be effective. Beyond knowing who these individuals are, you need to, it's very helpful to know what they do in Congress. What are their committee assignments? If they are on the authorizing committees, the banking committee in the Senate, or the financial services in the House, that's especially important. They're writing the policy on homelessness and housing. If they're on the appropriations committee, it's good to know that. And are they members of congressional leadership? Next slide, please. The other key sort of lens for how to do effective policy work is understanding the role of staff. And so as basic as the question of which district are you in, who are the homelessness staffers in that congressional office? If you're cultivating a relationship with the member of Congress, who schedules that legislator's appointments? These are people that you should not only know their names, you need to find out, especially now when no one's answering the phone on Capitol Hill, what their email addresses are, so that you can have a plan to be in relationship with them, to stay on their radar. These are specific individuals that, if you're going to engage in the policy process, you need to figure out who they are. Next slide, please. And then I think the third major point, for my part of the presentation to take away is, while we're very busy with all the activities of our organizations, it's super important to carve out some time in establishing these relationships? Are you inviting your legislators, whether it's the city council member or the senator or the member of Congress, to groundbreakings? If you're giving away turkeys on Thanksgiving, are you inviting your legislators to those types of events? Are you doing district meetings in normal times, obviously? Are you sending them your annual report, something as simple as that? Or if your organization puts out other publications, make sure that your representatives in Washington are getting your stuff. And equally important, sign up for their stuff. It's not something you need to read every day, but if you have a district meeting, it's very helpful to have been getting the emails or the newsletters from that politician so that you can see what is of interest to her or him. Next slide, please. And then I think all public policy professionals across different issue areas have found that it's very important to track policy through a handful of sites that you can digest quickly, regularly, maybe on a weekly basis, in some cases on a daily basis, depending on the area of public policy, but find a way to stay up to date on your issue area. And so there are news alerts and websites. We put out material if you sign up for the National Alliance's emails. You'll get a regular stream of information that way. I think the National Low Income Housing Coalition's memo to members has been, one of the most important resources for decades on how do you spend 5 minutes getting completely up to date on what's happening with affordable housing. Taking time to do webinars like this, but the trick is find a few useful resources that don't require a lot of time, and then check them regularly. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to close this sort of introductory overview of advocacy before we move to Dora and Steve's presentations with just a few words about coalitions, more as general principles, because Dora and Steve are going to talk about coalitions that they have helped lead. But I want to say a couple of things. One is that coalitions are a thing that I don't think the homelessness advocacy sector has done as well as we could. And I'm speaking broadly here rather than with any specific criticism, but in general, we're a community of organizations with strongly held opinions and perspectives, right? And there has been historically some amount of fragmentation, and that's to be expected. When people are dying and surviving on the streets, you're going to have a sense of urgency and strongly held views about what to do about all of that. I think it's important to recognize we're not always going to agree about certain programs or approaches, but on the big questions of winning more resources for homelessness, so the $4 billion that we got in the CARES Act, or the $11.5 billion that we're demanding now in CARES 2, that's something everyone should be able to get behind. And it's a huge objective that's going to take all of us to win, which is the essence of why we need coalitions. The basic rationale for coalition building is we can achieve things collectively that would be difficult or impossible for any of your organizations listening in on this call to achieve independently. And so we won't be able to have those kinds of broad coalitions on every topic, but on the big question of billions of dollars that will be required to end homelessness, we have to value coalitions and we have to collectively push in the same direction. Next slide. And so with that, I'm looking forward to hearing from Dora Gallo first, and who will be followed by Steve, to talk about the specific ways coalitions work, as well as some of the other topics they'll cover in their presentations. But just to underscore the the final point on coalitions, that while we don't always concur on specific disagreements within the homelessness sector, the only path forward to solving this crisis is a dramatic expansion of funding. And so in the work that we're going to be doing over the next several weeks with CARES 2 and then going forward through the budget fight ahead, that is, I think, a broad agenda that we all have to find a part in and to work together to achieve. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mindy to transition us back to the next part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. And I'm going to unmute Dora now, who will be our next presenter. And Dora, I'm asking you to start your video.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you.
Started.
Okay.
Everyone, this is Dora Gala from a community of friends. And Dora, I'll go ahead and start through your first slide so you can get started.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I have been just looking at the participants in the Q&A and seeing how many people from throughout the country are participating. So this is great news. Happy to share a little bit of the work that we've been doing at a community of friends. I think there's more pictures that's supposed to show up on this slide. Is it coming, Mindy? So while she's working on that, a little background. So I've been with a nonprofit based out of Los Angeles called the Community of Friends for 17 years, which is a pretty long time. And our organization's been around for about 32 years. We call ourselves kind of the original supportive housing developers. We were formed 32 years ago with a very specific mission of ending homelessness for people who have a mental health diagnosis. And at the time, we were providing services in an apartment building where everyone had their own lease. And we didn't have a name for it, but now we call it supportive housing. And it's something that we have been strongly committed to for 30 years. The next slide will give you a little bit more information about the organization. Because we started so early, 32 years ago, in developing supportive housing, we now have accumulated and completed 49 properties throughout mostly Los Angeles County, but also some in Orange County. And all but 2 of them are supportive housing projects where the tenants are people who've been formerly homeless and have a mental health diagnosis and other disabling conditions, and services are provided on site. We have 42 of those buildings because one of the roles that we play as a nonprofit housing developer is capacity building of our colleagues. There are many organizations out there, social service organizations in particular, who want to own their own building but don't want to develop that housing expertise. So we've partnered greatly with a number of social service organizations. And when the project is built and stabilized and with the approval of our lenders and funders, we've turned over the buildings to our nonprofit partners. And we've done that 7 times, as you can see, which is why we have done 49 properties, but only have 42. We started off serving individuals, but in about 1998, we started serving families, mostly single parents, head of household with a disability and have kids. And so that was an early part of our portfolio. And over the years, we've done veterans housing, affordable apartments for emancipated foster youth and seniors. And I think we've just become known as a supportive housing developer specializing on people with special needs. And we run the gamut. We do the housing development piece, we provide services, we have asset management of our portfolio. And about 10 years ago, we started moving into the property management space because many of you know in this line of work that when you have supportive housing, services and property management together play a critical role in helping tenants stay stable in housing. Our retention rate, you can see here, is very similar to the best practices, about 88%. But one of the unique things about our organizations, we also track 3 years as well, and about 65% of our tenants have remained housed after 3 years. Next slide. I'm going to do a little bit of a basic primer, I think, not knowing who's on the call and the various levels of expertise, there's definitions that I think it's important for nonprofits to be familiar with, the whole lobbying versus advocacy. And we should all know that nonprofits can lobby, both from a direct lobbying standpoint as well as grassroots lobbying. And then advocacy is an interesting term. Advocacy is not necessarily defined by the IRS like the way lobbying is, but this goes to show with this definition that anyone can advocate, whether you're an individual or a nonprofit organization and such, because the whole point of advocacy is trying to influence outcomes, which is what we do as organizations and individuals all the time. And it's a process of speaking out. I really like this definition that came from a researcher, is a process of speaking out on issues of concern in order to exert some influence on behalf of those ideas or persons. And we know in doing this work that we're advocating for the hardest to serve, the people with the limited means, people who are homeless on the streets. And then I wanted to talk about the context of our work in Los Angeles. So the next slide, I want to talk about homelessness that we all know, and I'm not going to assume everyone knows about Los Angeles. And this is not a pretty slide. I'm not necessarily a pretty graphics person. But these numbers are really telling in terms of what happened to Los Angeles in 2015. That column is shaded because in my view, that was the pivotal year from the homeless point in time counts. We were doing our point in time counts every 2 years, so that you see the 2013 and then 2015. And in 2015, the numbers jumped. The total homeless numbers jumped 25% in LA County. Encampments jumped 85%. And the chronic homeless population jumped 65%, veterans jumped too. And you saw those numbers in 2015. After 2015, LA County elected to do the homeless count every year thereafter. And so we've been doing them every year. So you see the numbers change. And veterans homelessness dropped because that was when the whole focus with the Obama administration on the veterans surge. And we really did a lot of work in that. And that you can see that brought it back down. But in 16, it went back up. And in 17, it went back up. So I wanted to show you a little bit about the campaigns that resulted from the homeless data that we got from the count. Next slide shows housing placements at that point in time. In 2015, our homeless count was at 44,000, but we were only housing about 11,000 people, 12,000 people. 2016, very similar numbers, 2017. And from 15 and 16 was when we started working on solutions. And I wanted to show you this just to kind of give you the context of how LA embarked upon our campaigns to raise the funds that we need to address our homeless situation in the county. Next slide. Next slide was a result of the data. A number of efforts came one after the other. And I probably should start from the local level, which is where I work pretty closely. Because of the data, it took us about a year, and all of you who work on bond measures and propositions know that it takes a year to 18 months to really get something together. And so in November of 2016, in Los Angeles, the city proposed a ballot measure called Proposition HHH. And what that was a general obligation bond that would generate over $1.2 billion over a 10-year period to construct supportive housing. We all know that supportive housing is the solution to ending homelessness and chronic homelessness. And we push that evidence-based practice to our elected officials and got the city council president and the mayor to champion it as the solution. And we built a big tent campaign to provide a ballot measure that people can vote on that would address the shortage of housing for people who are most in need. The intention was that 80% of the money would go towards construction of permanent supportive housing, and the remaining 20% would go to regular affordable or to facilities like shelters in the city. And that was really the first big effort in Los Angeles where You know, United Way got involved, the business community got involved, labor, social service organizations, various trade groups, even tenants and people in the community that were homeless came out all in support of this bond measure. The mobilization was pretty incredible. We used a lot of different tactics to get it out into the community about how important it was to have resources to build the housing for people who are out in the streets. You know, we used, you know, all the forms of social media. I remember there was even like a video of, you know, dancing groups just to bring awareness to that. And that was followed very quickly by the county putting up a measure that would essentially impose a 1/4-cent sales tax for 10 years in LA County. That money would be raised to essentially fund services for people who are homeless, as well as systems change. Because we know homes is the solution perhaps, but there are all those feeder systems, you know, the criminal justice system, the foster care system, that have impacts in the homeless stream, the upstream that ends up in people not having a home. Both ballot measures passed quite successfully. And then immediately from there, we transitioned to the state, because no local government, as you know, from an advocacy perspective that Jerry mentioned, could do it alone. We need state resources to kind of balance what the local efforts were. And we had a series of them in 2018, a statewide measure that would also provide housing, construction funding. No Place Like Home was also construction funding with some services funding. And then we pushed the state legislature through the state budget for $500 million related to services. The tactics and strategies are different from a local level and the statewide level. And I'm sure Steve's going to talk a little bit about the statewide efforts. You know, for an organization like a Community of Friends that's based out of Los Angeles County in Southern California in particular, you know, what we were able to do at the state, to play a role of the state, was there were more meetings and letters and mailings, whereas in the local level, there were things like rallies and things of that sort. But all of these efforts were very successful, and now we have the resources to essentially do the work that we knew always needed to be done to house people who are homeless. Next slide. And I can answer more questions if you have them on the various campaigns in Los Angeles that resulted in all these resources. But some lessons learned from a developer perspective, you know, an organization that's on the ground doing this work, is that it's really important to have a lead entity and administrative support, you know, some central office that's kind of controlling all the messaging and scheduling all the public relations that needs to go out there to get ballot propositions passed by and voted on by the voters. You know, fundraising is important. You know, we all do fundraising for our own organization, but when there's a statewide effort or even a local effort, it takes resources. At the state level, we were running TV ads, you know, and obviously someone had to pay for those. And all the organizations, even if you were only putting in $500 or $1,000, it really helped towards that effort. And we all understood that we all needed to play a part. And then, as Jerry mentioned, agreement on principles, right? You know, what are the key goals that we're trying to accomplish? And one of the things that was very important was that we all agreed that we needed to fight for a bigger pie before we even divide the pie. Very early, when we started to talk about what monies would be used for, the conversations fractured. That doesn't work when we're trying to advocate together. We have to all agree principally that we need more money. And then after we win this campaign, then we agree to figure out where the allocation of funds go. Is it towards motel conversions or actually services, or is it for particular populations versus others? And so we agreed to hold those conversations until after we won at the campaign level. And then infrastructure is very important too. You know, we are all so focused on our daily work that it's sometimes hard to pay attention to all those websites and emails that Jerry's telling you to sign up for. And so having this infrastructure, being parts of groups, you know, we had committees. some of these coalitions had caucuses, you know, in the supportive housing caucus versus the family caucus versus in the shelter caucus. And then we all kind of met together after we all agreed upon our own particular concerns. We came together as a group. If we were all together, 400 people at the same time, it was very, very hard to get any work done. So we learned to develop that infrastructure, and that works and makes it easier for those of us who are doing other daily frontline work. And then the last thing I have to say in terms of the lessons learned is that maintaining those coalitions, as you saw earlier, we had a series of campaigns. It was very tiring from 2016 to about and even now, I guess, continuing. We haven't let go of the relationships that we form, the coalitions, the partnerships, so that we don't have to relaunch. You know, when we passed Proposition HHH, immediately we went into H, and then immediately we went into the state campaigns, and it was the same group. And along the way, we try to add additional folks, but it's never resting on our laurels. One campaign doesn't mean we're done. It's constant reinforcement of the need because it's so great out there. And then the next slide I want to end with some basics, some basic primers on how do you do this. And again, I'm not going to assume that everyone on the call are complete experts at this, because I think we can all learn a little bit about how to do advocacy better every single time. You know, when we do calls, we learned very quickly that when you're, especially the federal folks, right? When you're calling, they tally the calls in the hot sheets, you know. And we always tell our tenants, for instance, if they're calling, don't expect to actually talk to the elected official or even the staff, you know, and only talk about one thing per call, because it's very formulaic in terms of how they are taking calls and on various issues. You know, letters, you know, I have to admit, I used to work for an elected official. So it's very important that you spell the names correctly. Go on the website, look it up. Indicate what the subject matter line is. Don't just say, dear so-and-so, and start talking, because a lot of the offices, the elected officials in the offices, they staff people based on their subject matter expertise or their subject matter, maybe they're not experts, but they staff themselves based on the issues that they work on. And so when you have a subject matter, they can easily route the letters to the right location. And then being very concise, you know, try to keep your letters to no more than two pages. Next slide. This is my last slide, is meetings. You know, I think Jerry mentioned talking about knowing who to contact, the scheduler. And I always say, take the meeting, even if it's just 15 minutes, or in fact, you offer it, I just need 15 minutes. And if you end up getting 20 minutes to 30 minutes, that's great, but take the 15 minutes. And sometimes when you tell them you only need 15 minutes, they'll take the meeting. If you tell them you need an hour, they don't have time for that. And one of the things I learned very early on with new folks, and again, partly because I had used to work for an elected official, is that, you know, if they're late, don't be offended, you know, and don't ever interrupt them. If they're so engaged that they're talking to you, even if they're off topic, let them go. Because what you want them to do is to leave your meeting feeling good about meeting with so-and-so. Oh, I had a good meeting with so-and-so. Even if they did most of the talking and it wasn't on the point, you know, you don't want them to leave the room thinking, that person interrupted me. I didn't get a good feeling out of that meeting. So I always tell people, just let them talk, because sometimes they just need to. And then the last thing, which we found interesting, was op-eds. In a lot of local communities, you know, there's an opportunity to write letters to the editor or to write an opinion piece. And a trick we learned too is not to have too many people sign on. Just a couple of names are important. And I skimmed this very quickly because I do know that these slides will be made available, and you can take a look at them and see whether or not they work for you and your community and your elected officials. And I think with that, I'm going to stop and transition to Steve on state issues.
Great, thank you so much, Dora. We'll go ahead and ask you to mute and hide your video, and Steve will unmute you and ask you to start your video.
Hello, everyone. It says, can you see me?
I can see you, welcome.
Excellent. Can you hear me? You can hear me. So thanks everybody for being on the call. This is a great turnout. Really appreciate your focusing on the topic of the day, which is lobbying in 2020 and looking at the crisis that we're going through as an opportunity. So I'm Steve Piasecki from the Supportive Housing Network of New York. We are a non-for-profit membership organization, which is statewide. And we also were founded in 1988, so we share that door, which is kind of interesting. Those were heady times for supportive housing. We actually started in New York City as the SRO Providers Group, a group of like-minded individuals who were noticing that all of the SRO housing in the city was getting gobbled up and gentrified all of a sudden, particularly in Manhattan. And they banded together and formed a committee to try to save as much of that housing as possible, because that was the housing of that served as low-income housing, places for formerly homeless people to live, and was really a needed and increasingly rare resource. And then we expanded to a point where we became a statewide organization. We represent over 200 non-for-profit and for-profit members that do a variety of different types of supportive housing, pretty much any flavor you can imagine. There are 52,000 units of supportive housing statewide in New York State as we speak. And we're working on more, of course, which is, I think, the topic of the next slide, Mindy. Oh, no, first, just a little bit more of what we do as our mission. We're in the education and advocacy business, particularly increasing the capacity of our membership to do more supportive housing. We have our ear to the ground for all of our member needs statewide, locally, and nationally as well. And then we also provide training opportunities for our membership. So I'm going to just focus on one campaign, which it also runs parallel in time with the campaign out in California and LA. We called this campaign the campaign for, it's got to be a red for, New York housing. And the reason it's a for is because we were building upon a series of agreements between New York City and New York State, which were cleverly called the New York Agreements 1, 2, and 3. Those, over a period of 25 years, added to about 15,000 units of supportive housing to the supply, and they were joint agreements between the city of New York and the state of New York. This campaign was different in a lot of ways. Even the size, you can see there, 35,000 supportive housing units. We started off by doing some research to try to get a sense of what the statewide need was, and then built out from there. We formed a leadership committee, and the main players, including us at the Supportive Housing Network, all chipped in to do fundraising, to be able to build some infrastructure around our campaign. That includes hiring a real lobbying firm and public relations assistants. I've condensed the campaign down to one slide, but it was a 3-year campaign, and again, it mirrors a lot about what was just described in California. We did a whole range of different activities, and I think the most salient one was a legislative education campaign where we literally had 10 separate meetings that were regional meetings with state legislators in the state office building, and telling them about the campaign, teaching them about supportive housing. The legislator that was our champion was really, really key to that effort. He was an early adopter of this campaign. He actually sprung for breakfast for all of these events, which really improved turnout. At the end of that education campaign, we had 133 of 150 state legislatures sign on to support our request. So what made this campaign different, as I said, is it did cover the whole state, and also is different because there was not much of a chance of getting an agreement between the mayor of New York City and the governor of New York State. this time around for whatever reason. And the campaign, actually, the dominoes started to fall when the mayor of New York City made a commitment to do 15,000 units of supportive housing over a 15-year period. And a couple of weeks thereafter, the governor of New York State, who we've been hearing a lot about lately, is committed to 20,000 units. So that is kind of the campaign, and we did all sorts of things. Rallies outside the governor's office on a weekly basis was one thing. We had press events all over the state, really galvanizing us. We delivered a obscene amount of paper to the governor, which all represented letters, individual letters, and emails to the governor as part of our email campaign. And all of this ultimately won funding for both the robust services funding for supportive housing and the capital funding to back it up and build it. Next slide, please. There we go. So now we're in a crisis of well, we have been in a crisis of homelessness, as you guys know as well as I do. Over 500,000 people homeless in the USA, and in New York State, latest numbers are 92,000, most of them obviously concentrated in New York City. And we've been struggling with this since the 1980s, so it's really endemic at this point. And the important thing with the continuum of care process, which we're involved with both in the New York City continuum and all around the state, there's 24 active continua of care that operate in New York State. And you guys are the expert as far as knowing what homelessness is like in your communities, and also knowing what the solutions are and what the situation is. So it's really important that you guys participate in advocacy. And I am talking to you from Albany, New York, which is our capital. And New York is not just a blue state, it's a red state and a blue state. And I start working on housing and homelessness in a kind of red, moderate Republican area that was key when there was a Republican majority in the House of Representatives. So next slide, if I may. So, and the cure, as you know, is to homelessness is a home. It's something that we say often. And specifically what we've advocated for over the years is supportive housing for those who need it, the folks that are quote unquote chronically homeless, to throw a label on it, or people that have long-term multiple disabling conditions. We also advocate for housing first harm reduction approaches and have been doing that for a long period of time. On a grander scheme, we're looking to address overall homelessness by advocating for more affordable housing. We've also found, and it's a couple of very important pieces, the rapid rehousing and prevention that continuums are involved with is something that resonates in legislative meetings at certain times, along with what I forgot to put in there is the coordinated access process. I think it's very valuable and worth noting when you are meeting with legislators or housing staff to tell them about these practices that you've implemented and how you're working to affect change and prioritize people who are most in need of long-term permanent housing. And the argument that we use sometimes in the other part of the state is the cost effectiveness of what we do, that we're saving money in other systems, be it mental health, be in hospitalization, hospitals writ large, incarceration, et cetera. And when we started, one of the early things that was attached to New York One was the first Dennis Culhane study. And now there's many, many studies that demonstrate the cost effectiveness of what we do. And then some offices, and part of what Jerry was saying, finding out not only who your member of Congress is, but what floats their boat is a key thing to focus on. If I may move to the next slide. So now we're living through a crisis which has been long and incredibly painful, and now we've got another crisis that is perhaps bigger and badder than what we were experiencing, and it's overlaid over our existing homelessness crisis. And that's really required a response from all levels of government. The things that we're working on today around the state are the whole deconcentration efforts and placing people that are in highly concentrated shelter, and also supportive housing in hotels if they need to be isolated or quarantined. We've been advocating and fighting for getting PPE to our membership. We're not the highest priority, of course, but our members are engaged very actively in providing services to people who have a high likelihood of being infected with COVID-19. And so it's been really important to advocate for that, and will continue to be. Rental assistance is looming to be a huge issue that hopefully we'll all be advocating for a lot in the coming weeks, months, years, perhaps. Rental assistance to me doesn't just mean paying for the rent for people that no longer can afford to pay for the rent in affordable and supportive housing, but also in cases where there's lost revenue coming into particularly our mixed supportive housing development projects, that there's some mechanism to provide assistance directly to our non-for-profit providers and developers who are looking at, in some cases, it's already getting reported 35, 55% loss of revenues on between March and April. And we've also advocated a lot and starting to see some things happen where there's mechanisms to pay bonus pay or hazard pay. It's framed in a lot of different ways, but to provide extra incentives for the folks that are showing up for duty, additional resources as a way of saying thanks for taking a risk and coming out to do this very important job. And you know from the first CARES package that we've all collectively won $4 billion in ESG. That looks like a C, but it should be a G, and it's $5 billion in CDBG. And we're looking for more in the next stimulus package, which I'm sure we can delve into if we have any time. But if not, you can count on the Alliance to be queuing you guys up and encouraging you to make those requests. So just along the same lines, as others have said on this call, reach out to key housing staff and in the House and Senate. And we have done a lot of work directly with housing staff. I find that goes a long way. Staff is responsible for having the knowledge and bringing recommendations to their boss, and in a lot of offices, they're absolutely key to getting things done. One thing I wanted to point out is that it seems to change on a really regular basis how best to get a hold of people. If you have, at this point, direct emails and cell phone numbers to text, the world obviously has moved more to text in the last couple of years. I remember when we started, we were faxing in our meeting requests because they were moving away from snail mail for all of that. So we've come a long way, and we also, I think, notice that offices are increasingly interested in meeting with constituents and using their websites as a means of triaging so that they don't have folks who aren't constituents requesting meetings. So that it's an important activity is to identify folks in your coalition that have boots on the ground in each and every congressional district. And then, let them know what your needs are. Let them know what you've been doing, as I said, and thinking a little bit beyond the immediate crisis now. And I'm encouraging folks on the call and folks in Washington to think about, how we get back to a place that's beyond the crisis, the COVID crisis, but also beyond the crisis that we were living through before the COVID crisis started. Part of that is looking for the Alliance's request of $3.1 billion in the McKinney-Vento continuum of care funding. That would go a long way to, I think, in conjunction with the continued robust ESG funding, to make the transition from short-term emergency to long-term permanent. And like nothing else, homelessness has been a bipartisan issue and should continue to be a bipartisan issue. That's one of the reasons why I got into this business. One of the things that we've been able to do on the annual request for McKinney-Vento is beat the drums in all of our 27 congressional districts and gotten more than your average amount of Republicans to sign on to the Dear Colleague request. I'm gonna stop. I think there's a few more hints, but some of them are redundant. Use data is important, but make sure that you're the expert in this field and they're looking to you for guidance. And you want to build a relationship so that when they have a question about housing or homelessness, they have you in their phone and will call you up and ask you that question. And my favorite recommendation is if you don't know, that's in a meeting, then I'll get back to you as a perfect response, because that gives you a reason to start to build on the relationship. So, and also don't forget to bring people with lived experiences into the mix to do the advocacy, because that's important to advance the message. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I am unmuting everyone now and asking you all to turn on your videos. And so we can see everyone's face, and we'll get to our Q&A. So one of the questions that we had, and I think this is as you all kind of alluded to, this issue of building coalitions and getting people to move beyond their own particular interest areas. Can each of you kind of share your insight from the years of advocacy and coalition building that you've been doing about building that bigger tent, focusing on the bigger issue, but still having the space for caucuses within for folks to focus on maybe different intervention types and different population groups. So there were questions about that whole caucusing thing within a bigger coalition. So would love to hear from each of you about your insights on that.
Sure. I mean, in Los Angeles, we have something called the Providers Alliance, and actually Jerry's fairly familiar with that. And that group has about 70 nonprofit organizations as part of it, which is really, really big. And a lot of social service agencies, you have housing developers, you've got legal groups. And so, when we started, I think we had like 57, and then it grew. And even now we talk about how do you kind of limit that, but you don't want to limit participation, right? And so one of the things that we quickly had to establish was some sort of structure. And I said, structure is always important because we're all very busy. And in the Providers Alliance, what we ended up doing was creating caucuses. And so Jerry played a lot of a big role in putting that together. Is we looked at the membership and say, okay, what kind of groups are we getting? We came up with, I think, 8 or 9 different potential caucuses. We let people self-select, to what caucus they want to be in, whether there was one related to domestic violence, one related to like legal groups. You've got the family groups, you've got the supportive housing folks, you've got the shelter providers, you've got, I think, LGBT community. So we had different caucuses, people would self-select. And then one person from each caucus became a member of the steering committee. So, again, the biggest issue is that, what is the common ground? And the common ground, the goal, the mission is why everyone's part of the coalition. And then that's always at the forefront. We all have a respective interests and the way we do things. And, but being a part of the coalition, having these caucuses allows us to hammer out the particular issues, bring it to the forefront of the steering committee and in the larger group. So I think it does work, especially the bigger the coalition, the more you're going to need these different interest groups as part of it, just to kind of streamline the work and the conversations.
Yeah, and I would
Go
say
ahead.
that you know, it really is working in three-dimensional space. And you know, when I envision what we were actually doing in our large campaign, there's an inner circle and outer circle, and then there's several intersecting planes that came across. We were fortunate in our campaign that it was really focused like a laser on homelessness, which resonated a lot in our state, and I think it's likely to resonate in your states as well. And that had enough urgency that we were kind of out on point with that. So the Affordable Coalition was grateful for being able to participate with us to get a really large, affordable package as part of the overall plan. But it's a lot of work keeping the coalitions together. But it's also really helpful to have both the people that wanted to play what we'd like to call inside baseball, you know, that had connections in the Capitol that they could work, and also to have a grassroots movement. So both things going on at the same time.
And I want to underscore that point about the inside baseball and the importance of groups that do policy as a major focus, but recognizing also that for the major things we're asking for, especially when you get into the billions of dollars, there aren't enough of those types of organizations to wield the power to convince Congress to write those kinds of checks. We need broad-based advocacy, much more inclusive than what has been the case up until now, if we're ever going to win the resources we need. And so Dora, who was instrumental in LA's Provider Alliance and is on the steering committee, made an excellent point that to get Los Angeles, which had not funded its homelessness crisis seriously for many, many years, to get sufficient pressure to finally win some of those resources, we needed a coalition that spanned from the religious-based missions in Skid Row to the organizations that were implementing, you know, programs aligned with the best practices of McKinney-Vento and everything in between: legal service groups, DV providers, youth homeless organizations. The key, I think, for thinking about coalitions in your own community is not everyone's going to agree about program particulars, but on winning more resources. I thought, Dora, your point about enlarging the pie before arguing over how it's split up, that is something we can unite around. And unless and until we do unite around that, we're not going to have a lot of money to argue over anyway. We're not nearly funding these programs to the scale that we know we need. And so we need broad-based advocacy.
Great, thank
Cindy,
you.
I know we're running short on time.
Yeah, I wanted to second the thing, Dora, about the let's all get together and argue for a much bigger pie before we fall back into the arguing over fighting over little pieces of pie. We are a little bit over time, but this is so important right now in this moment. We have one more slide for you, and Jerry's going to give you all something that you can start working on right now for advocacy. And Jerry, I had a last minute question come in that maybe when you switch to this slide you can talk about. It's the relationship of this next CARES package to other bills that are floating around, like Representative Omar's rent and mortgage relief bill. So everybody, we're gonna have, if you'll stay with us just a couple minutes longer, Jerry's gonna give you a really important advocacy ask that you can do right now. And then we'll sign off, but all of you and everyone who is registered for the webinar will receive a recording and the slides and additional resources. So thanks to our presenters, thanks to all of you for attending the webinar. And Jerry, one more advocacy ask, go ahead.
I'll be brief on both of these points. So on the slide you're seeing now, this just went out today. We are pushing Congress on CARES 2 and if you click the link and if you receive email from us, you've already you've gotten this information. We need Congress to include homelessness and housing funding in this next package of COVID-19 relief. On your second question, on the question about the relationship between standalone bills and the funding asks, we will get further in winning resources as well as policy like rent moratoriums by doing both. That to the extent we can make CARES 2 a conversation about the millions of people who are on the brink of homelessness and about to lose their housing because of this coming recession, we will do better. There are competing demands for the resources that Congress will be voting on. We want that conversation to focus as much as possible on homelessness and housing. And so whether it's Representative Omar's bill or whether it's the dollars for ESG, it's a both and strategy.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Thanks again to our panelists. Everyone will be gathering the additional questions and sending them to the panelists to get those answers out to you after the webinar. Thanks again for attending, and we will see you all on next week's webinar. Hang in there, everybody.
Thank you.